Hello everyone. I hope you're enjoying your course in Philosophy and History of Education. This is Marcella Bullmaster-Day, and I want to reflect with you on some questions and ideas about teaching, learning, and schooling in terms of progressivism and essentialism in education. I know that you've been teaching for a while now, at least a year, maybe more, and I want to posit that to remain vital in the vocation of teaching, when we see teaching as a calling and not just as a job, vitality depends upon learning to live the questions. There are some who think of teaching as being about the answers, but I propose that even more important are the questions. What questions might those be? Well, a few important questions include: what is education? What is the purpose of schooling? And what's the relationship between those two things, education and schooling? What does it mean to teach? What's the nature of learning? What is the nature of knowledge? What does it mean to know? What knowledge is of most worth? What should be taught? How should it be taught? To whom should it be taught? So let's go back to one of those questions. What does it mean to teach? You know, when we think about a question like that, we automatically think in terms of metaphor. When we think about anything, we think in terms of metaphor. We understand one thing in terms of another. That's what a metaphor is. Let's look at a few metaphors of teaching and think about which of the following metaphors guide your understanding of teaching. Do you think of teaching as telling, imparting, transmitting, transferring, filling, informing? Do you think of your students as empty vessels, blank slates, and it's your job to give them information? Or do you think of teaching more as developing and molding, directing, motivating, inspiring, shaping your students? Maybe you think of teaching as leading, guiding, showing the way. Or maybe you think of teaching as cultivating, nurturing, mentoring, bringing out what's already there in your students. I'm sure that you've thought about teaching in terms of a combination of these metaphors. But which are the ones that most shape the way you look at teaching? And then what about learning? What is learning? Which of the following metaphors guide your understanding of learning? Do you think of learning as acquisition, as getting? Learning is a process of getting information, getting skills? Or do you see learning as a process of participation, learning by doing, learning as doing? Or maybe you see learning as an act of creation, innovation, a generative process that leads to new things. There are some wonderful scholars who have thought and written lots about all the ways in which we might look at learning and the ways in which our view of learning guides our teaching. Ideas about teaching, learning, and schooling can be situated along a number of continua, and we want to look at just one of them today, and that's the continuum between progressivism and essentialism in education. Progressivism. Progressivism in education grew out of the wider social progressivist movement in the U.S. in the early 20th century. The progressivist movement was a response to the rapidly changing world in which we had industrialization, we were getting enthralled with the idea of bureaucracy, we had urbanization, and the progressives in society were looking at ways to look at all this and make society better. According to the education historian Larry Kremen, in effect, progressive education began as progressivism in education, as I just mentioned, brought in from the outside world, the bigger world, and it was a many-sided effort to use the schools to improve the lives of individuals. So in the minds of progressives, this meant several things. First, it meant broadening the program and function of the school to include direct concern for not just academics, but for health, vocation, and the quality of family and community life. Second, progressivism in education meant applying in the classroom the pedagogical principles derived from new scientific research in psychology and the social sciences. Remember, these were young fields of research in the early 20th century. Third, progressivism in education meant tailoring instruction more and more to the different kinds and classes of children who were being brought within the purview of the school. Remember, in the early 20th century, public schooling was becoming much more widely available to all children everywhere, and that diversified the public school population in many ways. According to historian Diane Ravitch, the progressive education movement of the early 1900s in the U.S. took 4 very different forms at the same time. And with each of these forms, though, the ideas embedded in progressivism undermined the premise that all children should study a solid academic curriculum. Progressivism went beyond the academics. So the first form of progressivism held the idea that education might become a science and that the methods and ends of education could be measured with precision and determined scientifically. This was the basis of the mental testing movement, which saw intelligence as fixed. You're born with the quantity of intelligence that you have, and the mental testing movement was used to sort students into the appropriate tracks. Remember, the IQ test was invented and developed at this time in the early 20th century, and it was used to determine which academic tracks and which schooling tracks students would follow. Another variation of progressivism held the idea that the methods and ends of education could be derived from the innate needs and nature of the child. This was the basis of the child-centered movement. Everything sprang from what the child brought to the enterprise, to the schooling enterprise. Another form of progressivism held the idea that the methods and ends of education could be determined by assessing the needs of society and then fitting children for their role in society. This was the basis of the social efficiency movement. Remember, the early 20th century was the time of industrialization. We were enthralled by the idea of bureaucracy, that each person had a place within the machine. And the idea was that only a few professionals would be needed, a lesser number of professionals would be needed in the future, and there would then be a number of managers needed, and then there would be lots and lots of workers needed. This social efficiency movement thought that society would always retain the same shape that it had at that time. And finally, another form of progressivism in the early 20th century held the idea that the methods and ends of education could be changed in ways that would reform society. They weren't thinking that it would always stay the same. They thought the schools could be used to change. Proponents of this idea expected that the schools could change the social order either by freeing children's creative spirit or, conversely, by indoctrinating them for life in a planned society. The first version there was the faith of the child-centered movement, thinking that if we just let everyone be free, society will take a better shape. And the second was the basis of the social reconstruction movement, which thought that the right kind of society could be described and determined and then shaped via the schools and indoctrination. So progressive educators, even today, and there are still many progressive educators today, they generally favor stimulating children's growth and development through activities that encourage initiative, creativity, and self-expression. Progressive educators favor an experience-referenced curriculum that features activities, process learning, inquiry, and problem solving. Progressive educators also favor collaborative learning that features group cooperation. They favor teachers who act as facilitators of learning rather than as taskmasters. And finally, educators favor education that is multifunctional and geared to the whole child, emotionally, physically, socially, and intellectually, rather than just paying attention exclusively to academic achievement. And when it comes to education, progressives generally oppose some things. They oppose formal types of instruction that feature routine over spontaneity. Progressives oppose a prescribed curriculum that emphasizes subject matter over children's interests and needs. Progressive educators oppose competitive situations that pit children against each other. They oppose instruction geared to test prep, only test prep, lots of test prep. And they oppose external incentives, such as rewards and punishments that are extrinsic rather than teaching children the intrinsic joy of learning. There are lots of proponents who fall along the continuum of child-student-centered progressivism today. And again, remember, it is a continuum. Things are not either or all the time. They're both and many times. But there's a continuum, and some of the folks who are on the progressive end include the National Council of Teachers of Math, National Council of Teachers of English, the people who call themselves constructivist theorists. Linda Darling-Hammond is a very prominent policy leader for many years and does a number of things, but one thing she has is an organization called the School Redesign Network, and it is very progressive in its bent. At Harvard, Project Zero, which is Howard Gardner's project. Montessori schools are progressive. The TC Reading and Writing Project is progressive. The Coalition of Essential Schools, it's got the word essential in it, but the Coalition of Essential Schools is a progressive organization. Most teacher education programs at colleges and universities are on the progressive end of the continuum. Educator Deborah Meyer, who has established a number of schools and done a tremendous amount of writing and is still writing today. Alfie Kohn, the Algebra Project, the George Lucas Educational Foundation at edutopia.org. These are all progressive, on the progressive end of the spectrum. And I encourage you to look up many of these things. The slides that go with this presentation will be in the extra resources folder, and you'll be able to click through to some of these websites. And then there are some proponents of social reform, a little more radical progressives today. Those include the folks at Rethinking Schools, rethinkingschools.org, and of course educational theorists and philosophers and thinkers Paulo Freire, Michael Apple, John Taylor Gatto is a former Teacher of the Year from New York, has very interesting views on the role of schooling in society. Bill Ayers, Peter McLaren, Henry Giraud. Again, I encourage you to look up what these folks are writing and thinking and have done. And then we'll look at essentialism. Essentialism is a little bit on the other end of the spectrum, and according to essentialists, schools should do certain things. Schools should be academic institutions that have a well-defined curriculum of basic skills and subjects. Schools should inculcate traditional values of patriotism, hard work, effort, punctuality, respect for authority, and civility. Schools should emphasize a core based on Western civilization and traditional American values, a core curriculum. And schools should promote students on the basis of their academic achievement. It's all about the academics with Essentialists, much more about the academics. And today, some proponents of various forms of Essentialism include E.D. Hirsch and the Core Knowledge Foundation, the Paideia Group, it's a direct instruction organization, Education Next, which is a publication of the Hoover Institution, and the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. These are just some examples of groups who are on the essentialist side of the spectrum. But again, when we have continua, do we need to think either or? Is that the most helpful? Do we need to place ourselves at a far end? Or are there things we can draw from both sides? This is important to thinking about any of these issues. Where do I most comfortably sit in terms of a continuum like this? So I want to leave you with that. Where do you fall on the progressivist essentialist continuum?